Does FGO need to improve? Yes. Hey guys, my name's Khadroth, and I'm a veteran content creator of FGO. I've been around from years, pretty much since the beginning, and I kind of wanted to address this. I always make a video at the beginning of every single year talking about how FGO needs to improve, but of late, and I see this kind of every single time we have a dead period, we get some drama sparking up from people saying like, oh man, the game is just not doing well, it needs to be like X or Y other gacha game. And so, again, this is a familiar topic for me. I address it all the time on my streams, but I do think it's an important thing to maybe do a little bit more of a deep dive so that you guys understand it. So, does FGO need to improve? Yes, but again, it's a game that's had its trials and tribulations over the years. It had a very rocky launch that, has been very easily cataloged, basically, all the way back on JP. We found out after the fact that the devs had actually sat down and basically made this sort of 3-month deliberation. That is to say, if the game had not improved to their standard, at the end of 3 months, they were going to close FGO down. So that's how rough the original start of the game was. And again, they did still have a very successful launch. There were a ton of people that really wanted to see the game succeed, and that is what allowed it to continue to prosper. And again, with that in mind, it has managed to have an impact on gacha gaming as a whole over all the years. In fact, it progressed onward and we saw many changes happen to the game as they started adding third skills to a lot of units. They started fixing the kits of units like Waver. And again, sort of realizing that maybe their original sprites were not the best looking. So they made a ton of changes and it really helped things out. We ended up getting to this year 3 sort of golden period of FGO where in that third year, we just kind of ended up having the game firing on all cylinders. It was a media juggernaut for all intents and purposes, as we saw not only did it come to an A and start to have success there, but we also saw, again, just like artists and the amount of media popping off for it, the discussion of the game always peaking on Twitter and being one of the most talked about video games every single year. And then we sort of saw this decline as the developers Delightworks went into doing Soccer Wars. And as Soccer Wars became more of a thing, it actually sort of ended up blowing up in their faces because they put somebody in the leadership position that probably never should have been. And the developers probably ended up losing quite a few people over this. We kind of know this from anecdotals and former employees that have said that they just did not like working under the individual, and so it probably ended up costing Delightworks at the time quite a bit of people. So from there, we ended up with the game going into sort of year 5 as this should have been the big year for FGO, was hitting a major milestone, and the devs had this elaborate plan to really help pop off with the Under the Same Sky stuff. And again, the Tokyo Dome being the location for the celebration of the 5th anniversary. And then COVID happened, and essentially all their plans got thrown into disarray as they ended up having to do all this work from home stuff, and they ended up having to cancel the Tokyo Dome reservation, and the game never really got its big moment like it should have. After that, we ended up seeing this discussion of bottlenecking and stuff going on. We know this because we had the sort of after effect discussion from the purchase of Delightworks' gaming division by Aniplex. And that's what allowed Lukrembo, the current developer iteration, to form. But we know that, again, they were seemingly having issues, and that's why it happened. But, I think at the time, the community hoped that a lot of that stuff was going to be positive and a good change for the game. But now, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't the best change. Maybe the new boss is either the same or maybe even worse than the old boss, where maybe now Aniplex has a little bit more of a monetization aspect in mind. So since then, we have seen, long droughts between story content and a lot of stalling campaigns with some dead time. So, and I'm not going to say that dead time is necessarily the worst thing for FGO. I actually think it's a good thing. It allows players to not only try out other gacha games and go outside, touch grass, reconnect with their family or friends. So it's not the worst thing in the world to have a game that actually does have some built-in downtime. Certainly the concern is going to be when the game starts to have too much of it. But let's not get too distracted. That was just more of a history of where FGO has been and why people maybe feel the way that they do about it. So, is it fair to compare FGO to other gacha games? I think that is the sort of core of this video. And I'm going to say yes, but no. It sort of is, it sort of isn't. That is to say, they exist in the same sphere. They're, both gacha games in that regard, but usually the motives are entirely different. Other gacha games generally focus on monetization first, with things like battle passes and giving out very little free currency but keeping the pity amount low, and then maybe even having a subscription model for that currency that sort of incentivizes people to pay for it and buy into it. That is to say, the entire way in which the economy of the game works is designed to make you spend more money. And to be fair, that's not necessarily not the case with FGO. FGO is a gacha game and it still needs to make money. But I think FGO is very generous with its currency that it gives out. And it's always had this sort of brutally fair aspect to its gacha where it doesn't try to hide the rates or manipulate them really in any way. You just know what they are and you either get the unit or you don't. But I will say that FGO, to me, its focus has almost always been on story first. That is to say, we kind of know this from Nasu's own ramblings that essentially his goal with this was to create this sort of live service visual novel type aspect. He really just wanted to tell a really robust, big story over time. And we can see that, as he has definitely succeeded with that in FGO, as FGO is not like other gacha games. And to a large degree, while gacha gaming did exist prior to FGO, we can certainly see that FGO had a huge impact on it overall, and that the industry ends up changing and starts putting a lot more emphasis on story post FGO's existence, because FGO sort of proved that it could in fact be done, and that you could make a very robust story in your gacha game. And I think that emphasis on storytelling is what really makes FGO unique. Its visual novel style format is what allows it to help bring all the characters to life. Its story is beyond deep and has twists and turns in ways that result in it having a very robust theory crafting community. And again, because of that, its character design and development is second to none really in gacha gaming, and honestly, it's very good even in all of gaming. And part of the reason for this, and I don't think this gets talked about a lot, is the fact that FGO is actually pretty genius in its design. Really, Fate in general is. Is to say, it's so easy for the writers to be able to develop characters, not just because they are good writers and do a good job with it, which they naturally do, but also because they have an easy fallback. That is to say, most of the characters are Fate's spin on an existing historical character or concept. And so as a result, they get to basically take the architecture of that and what happened historically, and then convert that into their unique spin. So they can fall back if there's ever anything that they didn't establish and say that the lore, the backstory of the character just is how you assume it to be. And that's actually genius. It works very well for them, and it's one of the reasons that they just have this, again, this easy backstory and bond lines that they can write for the character, because it kind of sort of just know how its personality should be due to the formative events that shaped that character. So again, I do think that's one of the reasons that FGO just does it so well. It's not just that it is based off an existing IP, it's also that it's based off the actual IP, the actual history, and that allows things to really flourish. Now, that's neither here nor there. So let's ask ourselves the question, can FGO learn from other gacha games though? And I'm going to say that for the most part, the answer to that is actually no. And I think a lot of people think that it should, but a lot of people are sort of missing the forest for the trees. And why I say that is because most other gacha games are not structured like FGO. I just got done telling you that it is a visual novel type of story, and it is very much episodic in how it goes. It doesn't mean that other gacha games aren't like that to some degree, but FGO certainly puts a very high emphasis on that. It is also a turn-based strategy game. So essentially, systems that would fit into another game might not work in this game. To give you an example of that, a game like Genshin Impact or Wuthering Waves that has come out more recently are both open world gacha games. Systems that are designed for them might not necessarily apply to a game that is not an open world game and is instead, again, turn-based strategy. So to me, that's not necessarily going to work well. Expecting FGO to be like those games isn't really fair at that point. Now, that being said, even though those systems might not work in FGO, it can still perhaps learn some things from it. So what I would say that it could learn is not the overall architecture or handling of characters or anything like that. In fact, FGO is doing a great job already on that side of things. But what it probably can learn, and what I think most people expect of it, is quality of life. And the interesting part about this, and why I still have the stance that I do, is because most of the quality of life changes that people want to see are fairly obvious and probably already known by the devs, and for various reasons they're either willing or unwilling to do so, or they have already stated that they're aware of these issues. So, for instance, some of the ones that they have mentioned already that we know they are considering is improving coins, fixing bond CEs, and improving overall craft essence selection and combining. But that is just kind of what they have mentioned. So what haven't the devs mentioned in this regard? Well, for instance, changes to the pity system have never really been mentioned. The USO system is almost always just kind of swept under the rug and never mentioned either. These are things that players want to change and want to see improvement on, and the devs just don't talk about. Now, there's probably reasons that they don't. This sort of thing directly impacts their bottom line, and they don't necessarily want to make changes to this unless they feel like they have to, because again, they make money off the system the way that it currently is. But they also haven't mentioned really anything with regards to improving FP rolling, or again, even sort of their plans for the future. I think this is certainly an issue that they have, is that, you know, again, if they talked more about the future, I think it would alleviate players' concerns for the overall direction of the game and what the devs are trying to do with it. I get that they don't want to spoil things narratively, but they certainly should talk a little bit about A, if they have plans, and B, how they plan to enact them, and sort of maybe the pacing of that. So they don't necessarily have to get into story spoilers to be able to say that. But to be fair to FGO and its devs, most other gacha games are trash at this as well. They really just don't actually talk about this sort of thing. And to a degree, I think that's one, because many gacha games just have trouble communicating. Some are better than others. Some of the developers actually have a more direct line to the community, certainly more so than FGO. In that regard, I think we could say FGO is one of the worst. But I do think to a degree that gacha games in general just don't really want to tell you what's upcoming out of fear of potentially giving people time to form opinions on character, story, and things ahead of time, and then maybe not feel as excited or again, good about it, and then maybe they don't roll the character, maybe they don't stick around and see the story. So I think they try to always make it a surprise and play things close to vest. But I think that's just a sort of commonality amongst a lot of gacha games in general. So why then does FGO so frequently receive criticism? And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. One, it's got an extremely loyal fan base, and it still makes tons of money. So that sort of combination of factors right there is going to result in a ton of criticisms as people go, oh, you know, this game makes millions, if not billions of dollars. Why hasn't it made change X or Y? And I do think that's an interesting point, and I'm not going to say it's unfair. However, I do think a lot of people maybe miss the context. They miss the forest for the trees again here. And the reason why is, you know, it's something that I do regularly as a content creator, because I get asked these sorts of questions all the time. So I always try to put myself in the shoes of the developer. And I do think that your average player doesn't. And I don't think that your average player should be expected to either. Just that if you want to understand why, it is something you probably have to do. And in doing so, we can maybe see that maybe the reason that they haven't done it, at least one of the possibilities, and this is still conjecture on my part, might be that the developers are not getting all of that money invested back into them. I think the assumption is for a game that makes tons of money that it's certainly got tons of money to throw around and to actually develop it and make it more robust in terms of its systems and quality of life. But the reality might be that maybe, Papa Sony and Aniplex are just sitting there kind of taking all the cash and basically not investing a lot back in. Heck, maybe Nasu is stuffing his pockets and trying to get rich and lay on a yacht somewhere. We don't really know. I can say that in Nasu's case, that's probably not the case, but it's still something that we don't really know for sure, the inner workings and how things work behind the scenes. In fact, we have seen times where there's maybe a scenario of too many chiefs, not enough Indians, where basically everybody just has too many bosses. And it may be the case because you have, on one hand, Aniplex saying these are the way things need to be, and on the other hand, Tight Moon saying these are the way things need to be, and seemingly both have control over the game. So that might be an issue in and of itself. Or maybe it's just sort of bottlenecking and a lack of employees. We don't really know. And like I said, there's all sorts of numerous theories as to why things might be the way that they might be, but it is something to understand that the developers may have a set of conditions that we are unaware of, and as a result, we expect things for them that are maybe not reasonable to be expected. Again, I do think it is an old game as well, and it has plenty of dead periods, and I think as a result of that, that just naturally causes criticism. Like I said, this is sort of what happens every time FGO has a dead period. We start seeing these sorts of, why can't FGO be like this or that gacha game popping up? And I think the criticism overall usually comes from people in the community that are the most passionate about it. That is to say, the reason that the criticism ends up popping up over and over and over again is because FGO has that devoted, loyal fan base, because people just love the Fate IP and people expect more out of FGO. Whether or not those expectations are reasonable probably depends from person to person. But I do think it's okay to criticize nonetheless. I think criticism as it exists is naturally a good thing so long as it's constructive. I think it's important to remain at least informative and positive with your construction, with your criticism, so that you let the devs know, hey, this is our expectation. This is what we want to see, and this is how we want to see things handled and how we expect to see it fixed. If you don't give the devs that information, you can't reasonably expect them to fix the game in a way that you want them to. You can't reasonably expect the end product to be something that you'll be happy with. So it is important to at least speak your mind, but make sure that you're giving them solutions, not just complaining. That is to say, constructive criticism is wholly different from things like, again, just outright complaining, trashing, and bashing the game. And I do think that FGO has this problem of its perception overall in the gaming sphere and the gacha sphere especially for sort of how it used to be. That is to say, in its formative years when its gacha system was at its worst, we had tons of people that got shafted by the gacha and still harbor a grudge. Those people still, for whatever reason, can't seem to let FGO go. And they will still, to this day, talk badly about the game, not knowing that the game has made changes. In fact, I still on the regular see people that did not know that FGO actually has a pity system now. So it is an example of sort of that negative stereotype that the game has, and it is something I think that the devs should try to address overall. And that's not to say that there aren't bad actors within the community. We see people that have sort of moved on and just want to trash the game and want sort of the notoriety of it. And I'm going to say, if you feel like that's the case, if you feel like somebody is being overly negative and not because they care about the game, but because they're just constantly comparing it to other things, would tell you not to listen to them, because it doesn't seem like at that point they have the game's best interest at heart, and it's more just them sort of eyeing those greener pastures and wanting to kind of make fun of the thing that they used to do and make people feel bad for their choice to continue to stick with it. Don't listen to those people, absolutely. But that's not to say that some people don't have good points to make, and it's not to say that there aren't, again, constructive criticisms that you can make for how this game should improve. So I think it's important at that point to ask yourself, does FGO need to change to be like other gacha games? And I'm going to tell you no, it really doesn't. And the reason why is, well, there's more than one reason. It's certainly aging, and I think that it could use a revitalization. So I think that's a fair thing to admit, that it definitely needs like new and exciting content to bring new people in and to turn heads and to get people excited about the game. But I do think overall, the community at large is largely okay with the game. We certainly have our gripes and our issues, but we still like and continue to play the game. And again, those reputational issues are a concern for the devs to fix, not necessarily us. Though I will say that the, again, community doesn't really do ourselves any favor in this regard. I see plenty of people that bash, obviously the gacha system and the pity system, saying they can't save up enough when it's mostly a personal issue. And I see plenty of people say that the gameplay is boring or stale or dated when it's turn-based strategy, which is a game type and genre that has existed since chess? Like literally all the way back in the day. So it's one of the oldest types of gameplay in the game. And it doesn't make it bad. It's actually something that has stood the test of time. And we see people criticize the early story in FGO saying it's terrible, when I'm going to be honest with you, the early story in FGO is not that bad. It's certainly not as robust as the later chapters, but it's not nearly as bad as some of the other gacha game stories that I have read. So again, it is what it is, and I do think the community can do better about that, but largely the perception issue is on the devs to fix. Asking it, though, to be like other gacha games is asking a zebra to change its stripes, and I don't think that that's reasonable to expect. It's essentially also discounting the amount of intellectual theft that happens with these other gacha games. We see this all the time nowadays, where essentially it's every single gacha game sort of looks back at FGO and takes ideas and concepts from it. It feels wrong to say that FGO should be more like games that copy its best points, because at that point, it would be a cyclical relationship where the other gacha game has stolen from FGO its character designs and its systems that it thought was good, and then FGO steals from it. And eventually it just keeps feeding itself, and gaming in general seems to get stale when that sort of thing happens. So it's important to still have creativity, still have unique ideas and perspectives on things, and not just copy everybody else, because nothing good comes from that. Sure, you get some homogenization, you get some standardization of expectations, but I do think overall these companies have enough money and capability to sort of prey on that and end up turning that to their advantage. So I would rather instead a company try to break the mold rather than just be like everybody else. And FGO is a testament to that, as it is still unique amongst all gacha games in how it does handle things. Other games might have new and shiny features, but a lot of that is just because they are built on the shoulders of all the games that come before it. And I do think it's important to sort of point out that FGO is not worse for this. It's a testament of its design that still to this day it is getting ripped off by every other gacha game that comes out. So it's certainly a good thing to see that FGO has a again, robust community and devout following to it. But I do think we can look at this and we can look at interviews where we literally have, again, like the Honkai Star Rail lead developer sort of saying, yeah, we totally took inspiration from Fate. We looked at those characters and we designed them to be the way that they are because we knew that would resonate with people. And I don't want to make it sound like FGO hasn't itself taken inspiration from things. FGO didn't invent every concept that it has, and it certainly does call back to and pay homage to, again, various other things in Japanese media. But I do think at the same time, most of the time FGO tries to put its own unique spin on it, and that is what makes it work well. Because again, it's taking that historical character and putting it into an archetype, a like character sort of stereotype that you never would have expected that character to be. And it's really fun when it does happen. And I do think to a large degree, we see this with other gacha games as well. But we also sort of see this, again, this sort of theft, this lifting of a concept or an idea, and it's not necessarily done really to pay homage, even though we might say that. It's a lot of the times just done because we know it would play well and we know it will make money. And that's why I say, again, other gacha games have a tendency to just put monetization first. Whereas usually with FGO, they're just trying to do fun things and develop the story first and foremost, and then everything else seems like a secondary consideration to that. And to some degree, that's really good. To other degrees, that's also why some of the systems in FGO are maybe not as robust as they should be. So I do think that's kind of the issue overall. But again, I'm not going to make it sound like FGO doesn't also lift ideas from other places. It's just we shouldn't expect it to constantly steal from other games in its own same genre, because things will just get stale at that point. So with that in mind, let's ask ourselves another question. Should we expect FGO to make drastic changes? And I'm going to say the answer to this is also no. At this point, FGO has been around for years. We know quite a bit how the development staff thinks and handles things at this point. Expecting the game to just completely overhaul every aspect and morph into a totally different style that you might enjoy more isn't just naive. It's also unfair. We can't reasonably expect that one day we're going to wake up and FGO is going to be an open world game, or that FGO is going to suddenly be a fighting game, or that FGO is suddenly going to be an MMO. It's none of these things. It is what it is. It is a turn-based strategy game with visual novel aspects. That will never change about this game. So I think at that point, basically every player needs to decide for themselves whether or not they enjoy the gameplay, the story, and every aspect of FGO, along with its flaws. It is a year 9 game at this point, going on 10 years. We kind of know the way that it works. And so again, every player needs to stop and ask themselves, are they okay with that? And for the majority of people, I think the answer is yes, but I'm not going to try and answer for you. You yourself need to decide that. And again, you can decide whether or not you're okay with FGO with its flaws, or again, whether or not you want to just pursue the new shiny gacha game of the month. That is always your prerogative. And I'm going to say it's perfectly fine. If you expect more out of a gacha game, if you were only into Fate because you thought it was popular or because you thought the units were attractive, then I'm going to say it's probably not the game for you. That is to say, the game is very much more about its story and the IP in general, and again, the gameplay being an enjoyable gameplay loop for you. If you don't find that enjoyable, it's probably best to seek those greener pastures that you actually do enjoy. And I think that's just being fair to everybody involved. And I think it's also important to denote that while it is an older game and it may not be performing as robustly as it used to be, that this is not a unique phenomenon to FGO. Even other newer juggernauts that have sort of come out since FGO's release have also struggled in the long term. An example of this that I can give you is something like Genshin Impact. We can certainly look at it and see that now it's been out for a number of years, and its numbers in terms of its overall active player base are not nearly what it used to be, at least not at launch, right? Sort of, again, over time, games begin to lose their luster. Games begin to sort of be solved and be known quantities. And people like things that are exciting and new. So as the developers continue to develop and devote time and energy to the game, they can keep that popularity, they can keep that interest, but it does sort of require them to keep a good pace with that. And we can see certainly in terms of Genshin that maybe MiHoYo's sort of emphasis and attention is elsewhere right now. It's maybe a little bit more on the Honkai Star Rail side of things, and maybe even Zenless Zone Zero that it has coming up, less so Genshin. It doesn't mean it's not developing things for Genshin, it doesn't mean it's not still doing things, but it does mean that over time it's maybe not hitting as hard or as impactful as it used to. And I think we can see this as well with FGO, and so I don't think it's that crazy of a concept. It doesn't have to influence whether or not you actually like or enjoy Genshin Impact or FGO. If you like either of those games, you're perfectly fine continuing to like them. Don't get caught up in these sort of rat race and popularity that we see where everybody feels like they have to be doing something that everybody else is. To some degree, there is some comfort in knowing that you are content with your lot and what you have. But again, that doesn't mean that you can't at least say that the game that you like and enjoy isn't perfect, and it does need to improve in some ways. And so I think we can certainly look at FGO and see that as it's going on almost 10 years of existence in one of the most volatile genres of gaming, of which gaming itself is just naturally volatile, that it's a testament to FGO's staying power. We can certainly hope that it improves and gets better, but we shouldn't necessarily expect it to make wholesale, wide sweeping changes that are going to fundamentally change what the game is about and how it actually functions. I think it's important to have that perspective and that context of where FGO has been and where it might be headed. But again, don't expect it to go to the moon. Don't expect it to transform into a different beast. It's not going to be those things. Maybe we see story things related to that, but it's not going to be like that in relation to becoming a wholly different and other game. So I, for one, will be sticking with FGO. I've made it apparent at times that I do feel like FGO has its issues and it maybe slacks off sometimes. It maybe has a little bit too much dead period. There are times that I don't cover the game as much. But I still love the game and am still devoted to the game and still want to see it succeed. I'm not under some delusion that the game is perfect. I understand that FGO is a flawed creation that is made by flawed people, that both Lasengel and Nasu can and will make mistakes, and that you just hope that, again, it corrects those, that it succeeds, because I love it, and that's really all I want from it, is to see it succeed. So to me, FGO has long since evolved beyond the trappings of a simple gacha game that I waste my time in, and instead it's transformed into more of a story that I look forward to seeing and experiencing with my friends over the years. Maybe you're like me and you feel the same way. Maybe you want to see the game just get better overall so that you can enjoy it more. Or maybe you're not like me. Maybe you're unwilling to accept the status quo and you expect more out of FGO to the extent that you're not content with it and you want to move on to another gacha game. Either way, I think it's important to leave you with a final quote here. And it's from Mahatma Gandhi. Be the change that you wish to see in the world. If you think FGO should be better, criticize it constructively. Ask to see it improve. Tell the devs what you want. If you don't think FGO is worth your time, please decide that for yourself and decide what you want to do with your time. I think both are healthy approaches for you and everyone around you. So again, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys found this informative. It's just something that I really wanted to kind of talk about because it's a question that I get asked all the time. Why can't FGO be like other gacha games? So what do you guys think? What would you like to see FGO improve on? And how would you like to see FGO evolve in the future? I'd be curious to hear you guys' thoughts. And again, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you for the next one.